I, being a bachelor, set out on an odyssey supposed to end toward the Pacific, which in the course of many years led from continent to continent all over the world. I can refer to these years in only the sketchiest manner in this magazine account, because all which matters is what leads up to my final meeting with the apparition of the castle. As I went abroad a decade before the outbreak of the First World War, I was led by some strange, irrepressible urge to the east. That there might be some higher purpose, some wise guiding hand in travels, dawned upon me first on a certain date when I went to visit the famous Campo Santo, that gorgeous paradise of a cemetery behind the city of Genoa. There, all of a sudden, I found myself in front of an exquisite marble statue of an extremely beautiful girl, and was frozen in my steps because there was the most striking resemblance to the apparition of my promised bride. "Why, here she is in stone," I said to myself. "How very strange! Why could not God grant it to me that I should meet her in the flesh instead? Why is it that I must find her only as an effigy standing on a grave?" I was moved deeply because of its minutely executed lifelike resemblance. As I stood there, I felt tears welling up in my eyes, a fact which embarrassed me because there were so many visitors around. But obviously all those sightseers were under the impression that I was a mourner, as indeed I was, and nobody paid any attention to me. Thus I stood in front of the statue for quite some time. All I could learn was that this beautiful girl had died at the age of 22, and that her name had been Elena. As if under a spell, I kept repeating that name, Elena, Elena, and it was then that all of a sudden the figure of a live girl in the same white dress seemed to detach itself from the statue and slowly walk past where I stood, looking at me. There was no doubt in my mind that she was indeed the apparition of my youthful days, and that she was alive. Automatically I took off my hat to greet her like an old acquaintance. Her eyes met mine, her lips parted in a gracious smile, and as eager as I was to greet her, my lips spoke, "Good morning, my lady." Meanwhile, the girl kept on walking slowly away from me and disappeared among the mourners in the maze of statuary. Only then did I regain power over my limbs, and immediately I started in pursuit, as I did not want to lose her. Racing up and down through all the innumerable alleys of the vast cemetery, I searched for her everywhere, breaking through the throngs of visitors and stopping every one of the uniformed guards whom I met. "Haven't you seen a young lady in white? I've lost her. I've got to find her again." Darkness fell. The bells rang. The visitors departed. The gates of the cemetery were closed, and I was still despairingly seeking for the girl of my dreams, mysteriously come to life and mysteriously disappeared again. The Carabinieri, of course, believed my story. After all, it happened often that visitors got lost in this jungle of statuary. They advised me to wait outside, while they themselves looked around everywhere. Finally, I was told definitely that no young lady in white was to be found anywhere. So that was how I found and lost my Elena the second time. A little later, after Mass in St. Peter's, I went along the Via Appia, and in the catacombs of Rome I found myself by the grave of St. Cecilia. She happens to be my mother's patron saint, and Mother had told me that St. Cecilia was my guardian angel who had dropped my cradle full of roses. So that was why I put a bunch of roses at her feet and I knelt to pray. According to the Roman history of the early Christians in the time of Nero, the dead were considered as still belonging to the society of the living, not as dead, only as asleep. Like also in Germany in some parts. In Latin they were called assercitus, which means called away. After many travels in many a land, I finally settled down after a fashion in Sydney, Australia, 13 years before the outbreak of the First World War. There I was employed by the Australian government as a civil electrical engineer and X-ray expert. I had become a British citizen. I had a good salary and a pleasant home overlooking Darling Point. In the quiet harbor, right in front of my doorstep, there was anchored the big 110-foot powerboat, a former torpedo boat I had rebuilt for myself and which I intended to use for deep-sea exploration and for fishing expeditions which often led me far into the South Sea archipelago. In these, my pleasant bachelor quarters, and in the night of the 2nd of May, 1910, I felt myself mysteriously awakened as if raised from the dead by a living hand. My first idea was that there must be a burglar in the house, and for a moment I wondered why my dog did not bark, until now fully awake I remembered that my dog had been poisoned a few days ago. Now all the more suspicious, and connecting the death of the dog with some plan for burglary, being awake, listening, I heard distinctly footsteps coming to my house, halting at my door. Then heard a key being inserted in my door lock. The door opened and snapped back, closed. 2 nightlights were burning as usual in my bedroom and hall. Presently I saw a shadow moving slowly from behind the wall. It appeared to be a woman's figure, head and shoulders, shrouded by a black headpiece like a lady looking halfway from the doorpost. Still thinking that the veil might be a burglar's trick, I sat up in bed under the mosquito netting. Then when the figure was retreating back behind the doorpost, both my nightlights were blown out as if by a shot. This could not have been through any movement of the air, neither caused by myself or anybody else, because my lights were in separate rooms, eternal room lights under glass and entirely windproof. In darkness now I reached for my revolver on my right side, cocked it and listened sharp for any sound of approach while sitting very still until the rising light of morning showed sufficient outlines to see I was alone in my room. Then I stepped out of bed. I went out to the terrace and around the house. I made a very thorough search but found everything in order, so that I decided that some kind of spook had entered my life again. This time I didn't like the prankish way in which it had extinguished my lights. In fact, the engineer in me protested against the unreasonableness of these manifestations. Cursing under my breath, I went to my daily routine, as it was now daylight. For more than 20 months, nothing happened, except real burglary attempt, but in the evening of March 7th, 1912, the real ghost returned, and this time to stay, when I was peacefully sitting at dinner in the early evening. For the last hour a storm was blowing outside, the galvanized roof of my house rattled with a deafening noise, and through the windows in the fading light I watched the roaring breakers pounding against my bathhouse, and my boat riding at anchor, shuddering from the impact of the sea, lifting itself to every wave like a reeling horse. Otherwise, in my house everything was as peaceful as could be. Tea on the table and scrambled eggs, hot toast, cookies, bananas and meat, but no wine or whiskey, a well-satisfied bachelor all by himself. It was exactly 7 p.m. when all of a sudden there was an end of the roar of storm and sea. Glancing across the table, I noticed a white-veiled form standing on the threshold of my door facing me. With my mouth still full of food, I continued eating, too amazed to do anything else. At first I thought my eyes deceived me, but the apparition stood there all right. After looking a second and third time, there could be no doubt about its reality. It was a woman, about my own size, and I noted the rich black hair unrolling over her shoulders, showing through the veils, so long it reached down to her knees. Even through the veil I could see dark eyes which fixedly stared at me. I also noticed that the light from out in the hall faintly showed through her form. A tremble of supreme joy and anxiety shook my frame. There she was at last, the apparition of Count Cosel, my promised bride. By the automatism of habit, I arose from my chair, addressed the lady with the conventional words, "What can I do for you, my lady? What message may you have for me?" She did not answer, but her beautiful face turned into smiles, the most heavenly I had ever seen. Still frozen to the threshold, she stretched out both her hands to me in friendly gesture like a child. As I walked across the room to meet those arms, I felt my hair raising and cold shivers running down my spine. The closer I approached her, and then I felt her arms closing around me, and I felt my arms embracing her, I cannot possibly describe the upsurge of a divine happiness, such as I had never experienced before. There was a melting together in divine bliss. Her wonderful dark tresses, fragrant and caressing, covered us both. There were no longer any chills, only elation and warmth filling my entire body. It was as if my feet went off the ground and she and I were floating in space. The intensity of this rapture was almost more than human nature could bear. Yet I would have loved nothing better than to stay in this embrace forever. Only at this very culmination of my happiness some substance evaporated. The body of the girl dissolved in my arms. I still could feel her gown and still could smell the fragrance of her hair playing around my head and body. But with the gradual disappearance of her form, my arms fell limp, and fear gripped my heart that perhaps I had lost her again, that perhaps she had sacrificed the very substance of her being, poured it all, put it into this one embrace. Struck with the horror that perhaps it was I who had destroyed her in my arms, I stepped forward out of the room into the large hall, and to my great relief, I noticed that she had not disappeared, but her body reformed again. Only now she no longer stood in front of me, but by my side, and as I moved, she moved with me. Her feet, I noticed, did not touch the ground. Neither did mine. With utmost caution, I moved step by step, and as I slowly walked around inside the house, she went with me until we had returned to the door of the dining room, which also served me as organ room. Here her form detached itself from my body, and now stood again on the threshold in the same attitude of a sentry as I had seen her the first time. For some unknown reason, she did not enter this room. She smiled and seemed at peace. It was as if I addressed an angel who was forbidden to speak, but understood all I spoke in any language in my strange attempts to evoke some kind of a response. Now this might sound silly, but it all served me as an exploration of her human abilities, so I offered her to share my food, invited her to a seat at my table. I thought perhaps the offer of a cup of tea might tempt her, or that some small talk about my faraway relatives may bring an answer. I asked her permission to clear the table, and she seemed to understand. Having set my house in order, I found her still standing there. I made a gesture as if I were about to retire into my bedroom. She followed me to the bedroom, and there she stood immobile on my threshold like a sentry or a guardian angel till dawn came. Then she followed me back to the hall where I went into my study, and finally back to the organ room, which she did not enter but stayed on the threshold. There followed the strangest week I've ever lived in life. I had the very strong impression that the ghost wanted me to go along with my regular work and ordinary pursuits, so that I went to work, and when I returned I found her waiting for me inside the entrance to the hall. She seemed to be glad to see me back, because from the moment I entered the house she followed me around from the hall to the bathroom, from the dining room to the kitchen. Only when I went to sleep she stood near my bed all night. I could see her standing beside my eternal lamps exactly as when she first had come. Although she never spoke, she most always pleasantly smiled, and she seemed devoted to me, which made me indescribably happy. There was an incorporeal love between us which approached the divine. On the 7th day she left while I was in town, and I felt her departure on my way home. There was no explanation for her going, as little as there had been for her coming. All I knew was that she took my life with her, that wherever she went, she and I would be united, and that she was indeed my promised bride. As she did not speak and tell me her name, I called her Aisha, owing to her veiled garments of an Eastern Vesta priestess and her spirit power. I have no words to describe my sorrow over her loss. May it suffice to say that mental depression brought my health to a very low state, so that a fortnight thereafter I found myself in a hospital and remained there for more than 3 months, unconscious most of the time, under a combined attack of typhoid and malaria fever. Finally convalescent, Dr. Breitner, the chief surgeon, handed me a bunch of letters which I had been unable to read in my illness. The first one I opened brought me the news that my father had fallen in a death coma on March 7th, 1912 at 7 p.m. at the exact hour when the ghost had appeared in my house, and that my father awoke every day again at 7 p.m. until finally he had died on March 10th at 7 p.m., which was the exact hour the ghost had left me. In 1914, the First World War broke out, and although I had become a British subject in the King's service, was in good standing with the community and employed by the government, the British saw fit to put me, for my own protection, into an internment camp. I will not detail the next 4 years in the Trial Bay concentration camp, since this was covered by an article in the Rosicrucian Digest, beyond the mention of the fact that I spent a great deal of the time in constructing a pipe organ from seacoast debris with the help of some Buddhist priests also confined there. When the armistice was signed, the organ went with me in the ship, which sailed continually through storms. I feared for the organ, my most valued possession, but the ship did not sink, and in due course arrived at Dover, from where we Germans were then transshipped to Rotterdam 2 years after the armistice. I arrived still with my organ at the old manor house in Saxony. During the 15 years of my travels, father had died, and one of my 2 sisters had married in America. Only mother, now very old, and my youngest sister welcomed me home. When I was still in the concentration camp, I had fancied, like most of the others, that it would be possible to pick up the threads of the old life after the war. Reality, of course, was different. I was working on some new inventions, worked out while in the prison camp, but found they could not be used owing to war restrictions. Most of the old professors from my student days had died. The intellectual life at the universities, which once I had cherished so much, I found to be in a state of depression. The whole country bore the stamp of defeat. I felt as if I were a burden to the meager resources of the family estates, which were barely sufficient for mother and sister. With my newly acquired patents of inventions, I decided to accept my mother's wish to go to America to my sister. Because my sister lived with her husband near Tampa, Florida, I chose the route by way of Havana, Cuba. On February 6, 1926, my ship, the Holland-American liner Edam, sailed from Rotterdam. The organ I built in Australia was to be a present from Mother, but then before I departed for America, Mother herself insisted that I should take the organ with me in her memory. The voyage to Havana was uneventful. I kept pretty much to myself and felt more attracted toward the Spanish passengers we had because they were a more happy lot of people. On February 27th, our ship entered the beautiful harbor, gliding past the old Morro Castle. I received my landing papers, went ashore, and found by sheer good luck a very pleasant and inexpensive hotel room somewhere uptown. It was the time of the carnival, and all of Havana seemed to be intoxicated with the carnival spirit. I had never seen anything like it. Originally, my plans had been to take the ferry to Key West the very next morning. As it was, I stayed 4 days, not to amuse myself, but held to the spot by some strange, irrational hope that I could find my lost bride in this carnival crowd. This was probably because there were so many beautiful ladies of the Spanish type who somehow resembled her, and because in this carnival time so many of them wore veils and fairy-like dresses, which made the similarity still more possible. As if I were a Spanish or a South American gentleman myself, I spent many hours on the promenade where the band played against the thunder of the surf and against the mad rush of the big open cars in which the beauty queens of Havana came sailing by in endless procession. To stand there on the sidewalk was like sitting in a tremendous open-air opera house and to watch some wonderful circus perform. But looking everywhere and always expectant of midnight, when the veils of all these beautiful girls fell, I never met with my loved one. The feeling persisted that she must be somewhere, and I went back to my room when squads of little Negroes started to sweep the streets from the refuse of the night's revelry, rolling up giant 6-foot balls of paper like snowballs in rainbow colors into the side alleys. On March 1st, 1926, I made up my mind that she was not amongst the ladies of the carnival, and that I would better seek my relatives in Florida. So I took the ferry to Key West. Disembarkation went without difficulty, but the telegram I had sent to my relatives had somehow failed to reach them. There was nobody to meet me, and as the last train had already left, I walked that night 12 miles under a beautiful moon along the railroad tracks. It was a strange sensation to be all alone in a new country where everything was strange to me and all the more mysterious under the moon. Florida, I thought, was not as beautiful as Cuba. In the course of the next year, I even tried several times to get away from there and back to Cuba. Each time, however, I felt myself drawn back to Florida by some mysterious force, the cause of which I was to learn in 1930.